Welcome, everyone. I am your host, the Historian of Horror, and I would like to begin by stating a fact. I am not an expert on horror cinema. I would consider myself a student and fan of the genre, having viewed over 1,000 films and read as much literature on the subject that I can find. However, the fact remains that I am not an expert in the scholastic sense. The goal of this series is to share my findings and research as I go from year to year, highlighting and discussing horror cinema, a genre that I love so much. I will be including some sci-fi, fantasy, and thriller titles, as the lines of horror can be blurred and are ultimately subjective. As you go on this journey down horror lane with me, I hope you will share your thoughts and correct me if I misspeak or provide incorrect information. I am always looking for the truth. Today's episode will focus on the time before the release of the first known horror film in 1896, Manoir du Diable, or The House of the Devil, also known as The Haunted Castle here in the US. As long as humans have been able to communicate, we have been sharing stories that scare us. Across every form of media, horror has found its place. Literature, folklore, radio, theater, paintings, etc. I will save the in-depth analysis of these other media sources for a different series, as each one presents an entire history to explore. While I am focusing strictly on film in this series, I feel it is important to mention some of the highlights of how we arrived at this iconic genre in film. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known surviving story in the world, tells a tale of a hero and king, Gilgamesh, who teams up with a half-man, half-beast, Enkidu to journey through a forest and defeat the great guardian, Humbaba the Terrible, a huge monster that breathed fire and was hideous to look at. The epic also details the gods sending down a great bowl of heaven to defeat the heroes as well. From the ancient Greeks, there were tales of horror portrayed through poetry and epics, as hideous monsters such as the Medusa, Hydra, and Minotaur terrified readers of the ancient world. The god of the underworld Hades was commonly included in stories in great detail, which provides plenty of terrible images of what we think of as hell. The Egyptians believed heavily in the afterlife, as shown through their hieroglyphics, the design of the pyramids, mummification of their dead, and their gods. Anubis, the god of the dead, is a monstrous half-jackal, half-man that resembles a creature similar to our modern werewolf. This tradition of terror has always been maintained through most religious texts, with the descriptions of hell, demons, ghosts, witches, vampires, werewolves, all described with the intent to keep people from entering down an unrighteous path. Dante Alighieri's Inferno offers one of the most disturbing descriptions of hell, with plenty of horrid imagery, as the sinners are sent to specific levels and circles where the punishments are much worse than humans can imagine. Every culture has passed down numerous ideologies, mythologies, and folklore that are too numerous to mention here. But it is crucial to understand that the tradition of sharing fear and horror have always been with us since the beginning of time. With thousands of years of various myths, books, folklore, and religious influences leading up to the 1800s, the popularity of the Gothic horror genre had some real momentum in the world of literature. Gothic horror is typically defined as a genre that combines fiction and horror, with death and romance being at the center of most stories. The origins of Gothic horror are commonly attributed to the English author Horace Walpole with his 1764 novel The Castle of Otranto. A large number of well-known legends and horror icons were created during this period from famous authors such as the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Jane C. Loudon's The Mummy, Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, all the works of Edgar Allan Poe, Robert Louis Stevenson's A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. So as you can tell from this list, some of the most influential horror icons were created during this period. The majority of these works are still being referenced or reimagined in today's media, with film, video games, literature, and television shows. In addition to the rise of the Gothic horror genre, there were also penny dreadfuls, which were another popular form of literature in the UK. These were published serial books that were also referred to as the penny horrible, penny awful, and the penny blood. The term typically referred to a story published in weekly parts, each costing 1 penny. First published in the 1830s, penny dreadfuls featured characters such as Sweeney Todd, Dick Turpin, and Varney the Vampire. So in the late 1800s, the literary world was filled to the brim with stories of horror. It only made sense that other emerging technologies would join the fray. Spirit photography refers to a very specific type of photography that seems to portray a specter or a ghost at any given time. What's really going on is that the photographer is using double exposures or superimpositions to depict these images that we call ghosts. This form of trick photography was popular from the 1860s onwards, not only among spiritualists but also among stage musicians and their audiences, who delighted in fakery as entertainment. These specialty types of techniques would be mastered by few and adopted onto bigger screens. At the end of the 1800s, the film industry was truly in its infancy, as the first major breakthrough came from France, when the brothers Auguste and Louis Lumiere developed a lightweight, handheld motion picture camera called the cinematograph. This device allowed the user to project images onto a large screen. The discovery culminated in the public screening of the Lumiere brothers' short films in Paris on December 28, 1895. There had been other films made prior to this. However, the quality of the Lumiere films surpassed everyone else. With the emergence of this technology in cinema, and so many rich stories and folklores to pull inspiration from, it seemed only fitting for this red-hot genre to make an appearance on the big screen. But first, there needed to be a way to showcase these fantastic stories, and what better way than with theatrical illusions, camera tricks, and of course, some special effects. Released in 1895, The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots may not be horror in the typical sense, but it was the first depiction of a beheading, the first use of trained actors for film, and possibly the first use of editing for the purpose of those special effects. It was directed by Alfred Clark and produced by Thomas Edison. Even though the film is only 18 seconds long, this was quite shocking for the time, as many audience members thought a real woman was beheaded during filming. With the release of The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the fact that many other directors and producers were beginning to enter into the world of cinema, there was plenty of room to try different camera techniques or other tricks commonly utilized in the production of plays. The first horror film was around the corner, and it would come to us from the legendary Georges Méliès. Known for hundreds of films, and possibly the most popular being A Trip to the Moon, this filmmaker would help introduce the horror world to the use of special effects in film. That will conclude today's episode. I hope you enjoyed yourself and will come back as we dive into 1896 and the first horror film, The House of the Devil, also known as The Haunted Castle.